Chapter 14 of The Jungle Girl by Gordon Casserly. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Linda Ray Nielsen, Vancouver, BC. The Devil Dancers of Tuna. Flat-roofed, arcaded buildings terraced one above the other with gaily painted walls from which covered wooden verandas and box-like latticed windows jutted out, surrounded a paved courtyard, its rough flagstones hidden by shifting many-colored throngs of gorgeously vestimented priests, mitred bishops, hideous demons, skeletons with grinning skulls, and weird creatures with papier-mâché heads of bears, tigers, dragons, and even stranger beasts. Wild but not inharmonious music from shaven-head members of an orchestra of weird instruments. Gongs, shawms, cymbals, long silver trumpets deafened the ears. Crowds of gaily clad spectators covered the flat roofs of the building and arcades, thronged the verandas, filled the windows, and squatted around the courtyard, these last kept in order by bullet-headed llamas with whips. It was the annual ceremony of the Devil Dance of the great Buddhist monastery of Tuna, one of the fantastic mystery plays, the now almost meaningless functions into which the ideal faith preached by Gautama the Buddha, the high-souled reformer, has degenerated. From all parts of Bhutan, west of the dividing line of the Great Black Mountain Range, from Tibet, even from far distant Ladakh, the faithful had made pilgrimage to be present at the great festival in this most famous and sacred gonpa of the land. Red lamas from western Tibet and yellow from Lhasa, abbots and monks from little-known monasteries lost among the rugged mountains, nuns with close-cropped hair from the convents of Thimbu, Paro, and Puaka, robber chiefs of the Hapa, and graziers from Sipchu, townsfolk from the capital, and peasants from the fever-laden Himalayan valleys, all had gathered there, for all who attended the sacred festival could gain indulgences that would save them a century or two's sojourn in the hot or cold hells of their religion. In a gallery adorned with artistic wooden carvings and hung with brocaded silk and gold embroideries, sat a fat, bare-legged man, with close-cropped hair and scanty beard, wearing an ample, red silk gown ornamented with Chinese designs, worked in gold thread. He was the Penlop of Tuna, the great feudal lord of the province, whose high-walled jong or castle crowned the rocky hill on which the monastery and the town were built. Behind him stood his officers and attendants, clad in silk or woolen kimono-like garments, bound at the waist by gaily worked leather belts, from which hung handsome swords with elaborately wrought silver hilts inlaid with coral and turquoises, and with gold-washed silver scabbards. The courtyard was gay with fluttering prayer flags, the poles of which, as well as the wooden pillars of the arcades, were hung with the beautiful banners artistically worked with countless pieces of color silks and brocades and needlework pictures of Buddhist gods and saints, for which the monasteries of Bhutan are justly famed. From the blue sky the sun blazed on the riot of mingled hues of the decorations and the dresses of spectators and performers. Especially gorgeous were the robes of the high priests in the spectacle. They strongly resembled Catholic bishops in their gold embroidered mitres, copes, and vestments, as, carrying pastoral crooks or sprinkling holy water, they moved around the courtyard in solemn procession behind acolytes carrying sacred banners, swinging censers, and intoning harmonious chants. Troops of baffled demons fled as their approach, howling in diabolic despair. Shuddering wretches, clad in scanty rags, groping blindly as in the dark, wailed miserably and utterly weird long drawn whistling notes, shrank aside from the fleeing devils, and stretched out their hands in supplication to the saintly prelates. They were intended to represent the spirits of dead men, straying in the period of Bardo, the 49 days after death, during which the soul released from the body is doomed to wander in search of its next incarnation. In its journeyings it is assailed and terrified by demons, who can only be defeated by the prayers of pious lamas to Chenresi, the Great Pitier. The whole purpose of these representations is to familiarize during life the devout Buddhists with the awful aspect of the many demons that will obstruct their souls after death and try to lead them astray when they are searching for the right path to the next world in which they are to begin a fresh existence. On this strange, bewildering spectacle an English girl looked down from a small balcony not 20 feet above the courtyard, and the sight of her caused the attention of many of the spectators to wander from the mystery play. The fat old Penelop frequently looked across the quadrangle at her from his gallery, and as often uttered some coarse jest about her to his grinning followers, while he raised a chaste silver goblet filled with merwa, the native liquor, to his lips. It was Muriel Benson. For weeks she had been a prisoner in the lamasery, cloistered in a suite of well furnished rooms and waited on by a close cropped nun. She had been surprised in the bungalow and overpowered by 3 of the Chinamen before she realized her danger or could seize a weapon with which to defend herself. Had she been able to snatch up a revolver she would have made a desperate fight for freedom, but with fettered hands, a helpless captive, she had been carried away on a mule. From the first she had recognized the pock-marked, one-eyed leader of the gang as the Ambans officer, and so had known who was the author and cause of her abduction. For days she had been borne along up the rough track over the mountains, through narrow high-walled passes, down deep valleys, and across rushing torrents, closely guarded but always treated with respect. Her captors used broken Tibetan and Bhutanese when they desired to communicate with her, but they answered none of her questions. She had dreaded reaching their destination, where she expected to find Wan Shi Hung awaiting her, and once, in fear of it, she had tried to throw herself down a precipice along the brink of which the path ran. After that she had been roped to a big, powerful Manchu. On her arrival at the monastery, she learned from her garrulous nun attendant that the Amban had been summoned to Pekin, where a revolution had taken place and his friends there hoped to make him president, which he regarded as a step towards the imperial throne. The monks of the monastery were his faithful allies on account of his relationship to the powerful abbot of the Yellow Lama Temple in the Chinese capital. They had agreed to guard his prisoner, if his men succeeded in capturing her, until he returned or sent for her. At first the girl, relieved of the dread of falling at once into his hands, lived in the hope of a speedy rescue. It was unfortunate, she thought, that Colonel Dermot, with his extraordinary knowledge of and influence over the Bhutanese, had left India. But even without him the power of the British Empire would be set at once in motion to avenge this outrage on an Englishwoman. Dermot's understudy, the assistant political officer, faithless lover though he was, would do all he could to save her. Assuredly she would not have long to wait. But as the days dragged by and she still remained a prisoner, her heart sank. She needed all her courage not to lose hope and give way to despair, for she had always hanging over her the dread of Wan Shi Hung's return. But she had resolved to kill herself rather than fall into his hands. For that purpose had bribed her cheery, good-natured attendant to procure a dagger for her. She pretended that she wanted it as a protection in the lamasery, for the door of her apartments was without a fastening. Even on the outside there was neither lock nor bolt, for escape was considered impossible for her. If she got out of the monastery, she would be captured at once in the town. She was not interfered with, and saw no one but her nun. Once or twice she ventured to creep down to the great temple of the monastery, drawn by curiosity and the sound of harmonious Buddhist chants intoned by the Lamic choir. But for her anxiety about her father and her dread of the Amban's return, her worst trial would have been the monotony of her captivity, were it not for the memory of Wargrave and her unhappy love caused her many a sleepless night. With nothing to occupy her mind, she hailed the festival of the devil dance as a welcome distraction. Not even the impertinent curiosity of the spectators could drive her from her balcony. She followed the many phases with interest, although she could not understand the meaning of them, for the performance was a curious mixture of religion and blasphemous mockery, of horseplay and coarse humor, as well as a strange impressiveness. A comic interlude would follow the most solemn act. Troops of devils burlesqued the sacred rites of the faith, and bands of comic masks filled the arena at times and delighted the audience by playing practical jokes on the spectators and each other. The solitary white woman attracted their clownish humor, and they danced in front of her balcony, shouting out rude witticisms that caused much amusement to the lookers on. Fortunately, the girl's command of the language, fairly good though it was insufficient to enable her to understand their coarse jests. But their intention to insult her became obvious. The leaping, howling mob of strangely apparelled performers threatened to storm her balcony. Some climbed on each other's shoulders to get nearer her, others even began to swarm up the pillars supporting her balcony. To the delight of the audience, the noisy mob eventually clambered up to the railing of the balcony, and jesting, laughing, uttering wild cries, perched on it and shouted and jeered at her. Her face flaming, the girl drew back and was about to retire into her room when suddenly she stopped, rigid with surprise, For above the shouts of the maskers, the roars of the spectators, and the din of the clashing cymbals and braying trumpets, she heard her name spoken distinctly. Incredulous, she stood rooted to the ground, and stared at the yelling clowns perched on the railing. The uproar redoubled, but again she distinguished one word above all: Muriel! A wild hope flashed into her heart. Pretending to be amused at the antics of the performers, she advanced laughingly towards them. They gesticulated and shouted more furiously than ever, but in the medley of strange sounds she distinctly heard the words: "It's I, Frank. Don't be afraid." They seemed to come from the papier mache head of a grotesque serpent worn by a man who was foremost among her tormentors and wildest in his frenzied gestures. Smiling, the girl stood her ground, even when some of the maskers, encouraged by her attitude, climbed down from the rail and surrounded her, dancing, hallooing, leaping. The snake-headed one was the wildest in his antics, and shrieked and shouted loudest of them all. But mixed up with the incoherent cries and sounds she caught the words: "Are you guarded?" A wild yell followed: "Can you get out?" Then he yelled like a mad jackal. With wildly beating heart the girl pretended to repulse the advances of the maskers good humoredly, and spoke to all in English, telling them to leave her balcony and cease to molest her. But with her laughing remonstrances she mingled the words: "I am not guarded. I can leave my room. I will go down to the temple and wait behind the statue of Buddha." Then the serpent-headed one, aided by another with dragon mask, both uttering fiendish yells, pushed his companions back to the railing, just as the Penelope spoke to one of his officials, who shouted across to them an angry command to leave the white woman alone. The scared maskers tumbled over each other in their hurry to quit the balcony. Thrilled with delight, the girl watched them go, and then, when the entry of a fresh body of mummers into the courtyard distracted the attention of the spectators from her, she withdrew quietly to her room. She was alone, the nun having gone long ago to witness the devil dance from among the crowd. Muriel opened the door leading to a broad stone staircase, and peered cautiously out. There was no one to be seen. All the inhabitants of the monastery were gathered in the courtyard. She stole carefully down to a side door of the Lamasery chapel. This temple was a large and lofty building, richly ornamented with fine wood carvings, rich brocades, and elaborately embroidered banners and hangings. The pillars supporting the roof were covered with copper plates beaten into beautiful patterns, and the altars were of silver, the chief one, as in all Bhutanese chapels, being adorned by a splendid pair of elephants' tusks. Idols abounded. There was a central seated figure of Buddha 30 feet high, heavily gilt and studded with turquoises and precious stones, with a canopy and background of golden lotus leaves. On either side were attendant female figures, and images of Buddhist gods, larger than life size, stood in double rows. Muriel concealed herself behind the colossal statue of Buddha, and had not long to wait before from her hiding place she saw two maskers, the snake and the dragon, enter the temple cautiously. The latter remained on guard at the door, while his companion, who carried a bundle, advanced furtively towards the great idol. As he drew near he opened the jaws of the mask and said in a low tone, "Muriel, Muriel, are you here?" At the sound of the well-remembered voice the girl trembled violently. Her heart beat quickly as she came out from behind the statue. When he beheld her the masker lifted the snake's head off, and Muriel saw that the face revealed, disguised and stained a dull yellow, was that of her lover. At the sight of it she forgot the painful past, forgot her grievance against him, forgot the other woman, the sorrow that he had caused her, and he sprang towards her with outstretched arms. She cried, "Oh, thank God you've come, dear!" Frank caught her in his eager embrace. Then, under the image of the great dreamer who taught that love is illusion, that affection is error, that desire but binds closer to the revolving wheel, they kissed fondly, passionately, like two faithful lovers, met again after a lifetime of parting, and the grotesque devil gods around glared fiercely at them. But the Lord Buddha looked mildly down on his sculptured face, the ineffable calm of Nirvana, the peace of freedom from all desire attained at last. But heedless of gods or devils, the man strained the woman to his heart, and rained kisses on her lips, her eyes, her hair. There was little time for dalliance. Danger encompassed them. Wargrave produced from the bundle that he carried a mask and a costume with a pair of high, felt-soled boots, which effectively disguised Muriel. Then they joined Tashi, and the three passed out into the vestibule only just in time, for here they found a group of llamas and peasants from a distant part of the country, stopping for a moment to look at the great pictured cycle of existence painted on the wall before they entered the temple. The vestibule opened on to a courtyard lined with the cells of the monks of the monastery, and, as this led to the great quadrangle in which the miracle play was being performed, a stream of mummers, llamas, and laymen was passing through it, mostly going to the spectacle, though a few were coming away from it. With Muriel clinging closely to him, Wargrave followed Tashi as he pushed his way through the crowd, exchanging jokes and careless banter as he went. The rabbit warren of steep lanes, flights of steps, and bridges over ravines through the town built on the precipitous slopes of the hill was almost deserted, for most of the inhabitants had flocked to the devil dance. So unmolested and unnoticed they reached the caravanserai in which the two men had lodged for several days before the festival. Here they hurriedly changed their costumes. When they emerged from it, Muriel, her hair cropped almost to the scalp, and her face stained a yellowish tint, was garbed as a boy novice of the lamasery in the priestly dress, with a great rosary round her neck. In one hand she held a begging bowl, while with the other she guided the feeble steps of the aged lama whose disciple she was supposed to be. Behind them limped a lame lay brother of their monastery. In this disguise the fugitives met with no hindrance as they quitted the town for the open country, heading towards the south. Only when well clear of the houses did Frank and Muriel venture to converse in their own language. Wargrave narrated all that had happened to him since they had parted. Any one watching them beyond earshot would have wondered at the joy that shone in the face of the young chela disciple. clasping the hand of the old priest and gazing affectionately at him as they went along, for Frank was telling the girl of Violet's letter which had set him free. He described many fruitless attempts to cross the frontier, his fortunate meeting with Bagshaw, and the marvelous way in which the wonderful animal had helped him. Safely inside Bhutan, he and Tashi had parted with the elephants in which appeared to be the same forest as the one in which Colonel Dermot and they had left the herd on their previous entry into the country. Frank had tried to imitate his chief in ordering Bagshaw to meet him there again, but he was very doubtful of the result. They had not found it difficult to follow the trail left by Muriel's abductors, for once inside the border the Chinamen had not tried to hide themselves. At every village along the rough road, Tashi had learned of their passing with their captive, so the two had followed them without difficulty to Tuna, where they soon discovered where the girl was imprisoned. The festival had offered them an unhoped for opportunity of reaching her. Tashi, once a star performer in similar devil dances in his own monastery, procured costumes and taught his companion what to do. As the number of those taking part in the performances ran to hundreds, it was easy to slip in unobserved among them. Then Muriel told of her adventures, but far more interesting to both than the details of these mere happenings, each revealed to the other the longings, the love, the hopes and fears that had filled his and her heart during the unhappy period of their estrangement. Now began a wonderful odyssey that, but for the dread of pursuit and capture, would have seemed a journey in fairyland to the reunited lovers. Indeed, as they traveled on day after day, and danger seemed left behind, they forgot everything in the joy of being together once more. Their vows exchanged, their faith pledged, the future a long vista of golden days of delight. It was well that Tashi was with them to be on the watch, for the lovers walked with their heads in the clouds. And certainly theirs was an interesting pilgrimage. Bhutan is perhaps the least known country in Asia, the last that has kept its cherished seclusion since Anglo-Indian troops burst the barrier of Tibet and flaunted the Union Jack in the streets of the fabled city of Lhasa. But Bhutan is still a secret, a mysterious land. Only a few British envoys, from Bogle in the latter half of the 18th century to Claude White and Bell in the beginning of this, and their companions, had intruded on its privacy before Colonel Dermot, so that for the lovers it had all the fascination of the unknown. Sometimes, among the ice-clad peaks of the giant ranges of the Himalayas, they crossed snowy passes 14,000 feet above the sea, and did not neglect to throw a stone upon the oboes, the cairns that pious and superstitious travelers erect to propitiate the spirits of the passes. Sometimes the path led under beautiful cliffs of pure white crystalline limestone, that in the brilliant sunlight shone like the finest marble. Often they journeyed through a lovely land of gently sloping hills, of grassy uplands, of deep valleys giving delightful vistas, of snow-clad mountains far away. They walked through pine woods, through forests of maple, silver fir, and larch, and miles of huge bushes of flowering rhododendrons. They toiled up a rough and stony track over bare and desolate land, that was an old moraine, and under moraine terraces one above another, forming giant spurs of the rugged hills. There were dark and fearsome ravines, so deep that they could scarcely hear the roar of the foaming torrents rushing among the great boulders below, as they crossed on swaying suspension bridges of iron chains. These had been built hundreds of years before by long forgotten Chinese engineers. Three chains on one level supported the bamboo or plank footway, while one on either side served as a hand rail, and a bamboo or grass lattice work between them and the road bears hid from sight the deep gorge below. Often these bridges were only of ropes of twisted withes or grass, and swung and swayed in terrifying fashion with the motion of the traveler. There were broad rivers over the eddying, swirling waters of which strong cantilever bridges of stout wooden beams were pushed out from the steep banks. Truly a beautiful land, Bhutan, at its loveliest perhaps in spring, when the hills and upland meadows where the yaks graze, 10,000 feet above the sea, blaze with the mingled colors of anemones blue and white, of yellow pansies and mauve and white irises, of large and white roses and small yellow ones, of giant yellow primulas with 6 tiers of flowers, when the oaks and the chestnuts are clothed in young green, and the apricot, pear, and orange trees are in bloom, where large and lovely blossoms cover that little known tree that the Bhutanese call chap, when the bright green of the young grass runs up to the white snowfields. The woods are full of a pretty ground orchid, beautiful trailing blossoms of others droop from the boughs of the great trees, and on the magnesium limestone hills one of the rarest orchids grows in profusion. But to the two pilgrims of love the land seemed beautiful even now that the winter was not far distant. In the silent woods, hidden from prying eyes, they sat hand in hand and whispered to each other over and over again the oldest, sweetest story that the earth has known. Strange to hear words of love from the lips of such a weird looking couple. Yet Muriel in her quaint disguise with her silky hair cropped to the scalp was as beautiful in her lover's eyes as when he had seen her in her prettiest frocks, and she thought the yellow skinned, wrinkled old llama indefinitely more attractive than the gay young subaltern of Ranga Duar, for he was her own now. Such is lover's glamour. Muriel had forgiven royally. Bhutan is a Buddhist ruled land, therefore slaying for sport and fishing in the rivers is prohibited. Nay, more, the Maharaja sometimes forbids the killing of even domestic animals for food. So wild life abounds. The fugitives often saw flocks of burhel, called now in Bhutan, feeding on the precipitous slopes of the higher hills. Once Frank and Muriel excitedly watched a snow leopard stalking one of these big horned sheep 16,000 feet above the sea level. And in these heights they even saw an occasional lynx or wolf, generally only to be found in the highest elevations bordering on Tibet. Silver-haired langur apes, the white fringes around their black faces giving them a comic resemblance to aged negroes, awoke the echoes of the mountains with their deep booming cry, while in the lower valleys little brown monkeys mopped and mowed from the trees at the fugitives as they passed. On one occasion Muriel, exhilarated by the keen, life-giving air, ran gaily on ahead of the others in a wood, and came on a tiger enjoying its midday siesta. But the striped Butte only uttered a startled "whoa, whoa," like a big dog, and dashed away through the undergrowth. Another time they disturbed a red bear feeding on the carcass of a strange beast that seemed a mixture of goat, donkey, and deer. Tashi called it a serow, and at a lower elevation they blundered on two black bears, not flesh eaters these, yet more dangerous, grubbing for roots, and on another occasion saw one climbing a tree in search of wild bees' nests. In a dense jungle, early one morning, a beautiful black panther with a skin like watered silk glided stealthily by them, showing its white fangs and red mouth in an angry snarl as it went. And deep down in a valley they espied a rhinoceros feeding 1,000 feet below them. But they came across no elephants, and Frank noted the fact despairingly as rendering even less probable a meeting with Bagshaw and his herd. Bird life abounded, from the snow partridges that flew in the hills 18,000 feet high to pigeons of every kind. Birds of all sizes, from great eagles to the little quails that hid in the cornfields. Lammergeiers that were fed on human bodies, the dead of families of high degree, exposed on a flat rock of slate with head and shoulders tied to a wooden axle that stretched the corpse like a rack. In Bhutan, ordinary folk are cremated. On their journey the fugitives met with wayfarers of every rank and class. On a steep mountain track they stood aside to let a high official go by. He was sitting pick-a-back in a cloth on a powerfully built servant. The ends of the cloth nodded on the man's forehead. Behind trudged an escort of bare-legged swordsmen with leather shields and shining steel helmets. Coolies, male and female, followed, carrying the great man's baggage in baskets placed in the crutch of forked sticks tied on their backs. Sometimes they passed a rival lama glaring with jealous eye at them. Often they met groups of ryats, sturdy peasants, thick-limbed, bare-footed, bare-headed, the women clear-eyed, deep-bosomed, but uglier than the males. These did reverence to the holy men and put their modest offerings of copper coins or food into Muriel's begging bowl. Another time it was a family group at food, eating by the wayside. The group consisted of a stout, ruddy-faced woman with close-cropped hair, hung with many necklaces of coral and turquoise, and waited on by her three meek and submissive husbands, all brothers, for this is a land of polyandry. She invited the fugitives to share their meal, and bade her dutiful spouses serve the supposed lamas. They proffered cooked rice colored with saffron, and other food in the excellent Bhutanese baskets, woven with very finely split cane. These are made in two circular parts with rounded top and bottom pieces, fitting so well that water can actually be carried in them. From sealed wicker covered bamboos the host filled chungas, bamboo mugs, with merwa, the beer of the country, and chang, the native spirit. Frank and Muriel refused the liquor, but Tashi drank their share as well as his, to give the pious peasants an opportunity of acquiring merit, and wife and husbands thought themselves amply rewarded by a muttered blessing. A very different figure was that of a man lame of the right leg and limping painfully down a steep hill in front of the fugitives. Muriel, full of pity, whispered to her lover after they had passed him: "Oh, the poor wretch! Did you see, dear? He had lost the right hand as well." But she shuddered when she learned that the cripple was a murderer punished by the severing of the tendons of the leg and the loss of the hand that struck the fatal blow. In the cultivated valleys where barley, buckwheat, and mustard grew, there were everywhere evidences of the religious feeling of the western Bhutanese. Every hill was crowned with a gompa or chapel. Chortens and praying wheels stood beside the road, and mendongs or praying walls a mile long, their stones engraved with sacred words, were built near habitations. In the villages the disguised fugitives were well treated. Food and lodging were offered them freely in the cabins as in the great houses of officials and rich folks, where they spent hours watching the skilled artisans among the feudal retainers of their hosts weaving silk, making woolen and cotton garments, brocade and embroideries, or hammering artistic designs on silver or copper plates backed with lac. None suspected the three of being other than they seemed. The Buddhism of Bhutan and Tibet to day has but one article of faith: acquire merit by feeding and paying the lamas, and they will win salvation for you. So rich and poor vied in giving their best to the holy wayfarers, and sought not to intrude on the meditations or privacy of lama and chela, and welcomed the cheery company of the more worldly lay brother who could crack a joke or empty a mug with any man and pitch the stone quoits or shoot an arrow in the archery contests better than the village champion. Thus contentedly, and free from care, the three fugitives wandered on towards the south, where on the frontier they expected their troubles to begin. One day, when passing a hamlet by the roadside, they tarried to look on at a wedding at which a buxom country maid was being married to a family of 6 brothers. The village headman performed the simple ceremony, which consisted of offering a bowl of merwa to the gods, then presenting a cupful to the bride and eldest bridegroom, blessing them, and expressing a hope that the union might be a fruitful one. The rest, after the usual presents had been given to the bride's relatives, was simply a matter of feasting everyone. The stranger lamas were invited to join, but Frank refused and dragged away the convivial Tashi, who was anxious to accept the invitation. Wargrave with difficulty led him aside, and was so occupied in arguing with his discontented guide that he did not notice that Muriel had not followed. A sudden cry from her and his name shrieked out wildly made him turn in alarm. To his horror he saw the girl struggling in the grasp of a Chinaman, while another on a mule and holding the bridle of a second animal was calling on the villagers in the Penlop's name to assist his comrade. End of chapter 14. Recording by Linda Marie Nielsen, Vancouver, BC.